QSO Today, episode 497, Steve Shorey, G3ZPS. This episode of QSO Today is listener-sponsored. Only you can keep the QSO Today podcast coming to you every weekend since 2014. Please become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor banner on the show notes page or at the top of the QSOtoday.com webpage. I want to thank our new listener sponsors this week. Maurice Gunderson, KK6BXO, $100 yearly, and Thomas White, 86TW, $10 a month. I also want to thank Glenn Jenkins, WB4KTF, for his $180 donation, and Jeffrey Tafuri, KO4NCC, who sponsored with his $85 donation the transcription of last week's episode with Rod Deutsch, 4Z1AC. This transcription will be posted next week. My thanks to everyone who continues to support QSO Today with their sponsorships, donations, and using the Amazon link before shopping at Amazon. All of it keeps QSO Today on the air. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, amateur call sign 4Z1UG, where I demonstrate the diversity and relevance of the amateur radio hobby and its impact on society by interviewing ham radio operators, many of whom played vital roles in shaping our technology through the amateur radio hobby. And while many people might say, ham radio, do people still do that? This podcast demonstrates through in-depth interviews just how amazing, diverse, and dynamic the amateur radio hobby continues to be. If you're new to QSO Today, please be sure to look at the QSOtoday.com website, where we have almost 500 interviews and show notes with amateur radio operators. From there, you can click on links to take you to the QSO Today Academy. Our catalog contains over 500 videos on every ham radio subject, completely searchable. In my attempt to find a possible date for the next QSO Today Academy event, I could not find a single ham radio calendar of events to find that reasonable date. So this week I created an online calendar that you can use to add your event. Once I approve your event, then it posts to a list of events in chronological order and updates a Google Calendar. You can go to hamradiocalendar.com to get the new calendar or use the menu bar at the top of the QSO Today website. Before we begin, I want to inform you that my friend Alexandre Grimberg, PY1AHD, creator of the Alex Loop antenna and a big contributor to amateur radio, passed away this week in his home city of Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. Alexandre was first licensed in 1971 at the tender age of 22, and he told his story on QSO Today in episode 197, 6 years ago. Alexandre's death seems premature. May his memory be for a blessing. Steve Shorey, G3ZPS, is a longtime ham who, like me, took a break from ham radio to raise his family, but returned to the hobby, restoring the radios that he longed to have as a kid in the 1960s. He features many of these classic Drake, Jesus, Swan, and others on his website. G3ZPS tells his ham radio story in this QSO Today. G3ZPS, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, Steve?
I am 4Z5UG. This is G3ZPS. Very good day to you, Eric.
I used to be 4Z5UG when I had the general class in Israel. I'm now 4Z1UG. I'm now the class 1.
Oh, well.
So for people out there that want to know the difference between a 1 and a 5, now there's a 4 in there, and I don't know what that means. That must mean something else. Steve, thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you, and include the hometown where you grew up?
Well, I grew up in southeast London in a place called Bromley, which is a suburb of southeast London. It was actually in the county of Kent, and it still sort of is. It claims it's got a sort of a postcode outside London, but it's actually London. My background really is that my father was involved in some sort of radio technology after the war. He worked for the GPO, which is BT, which is the General Post Office, who sorted out all the telephones in the UK.
So BT was British Telecom, right?
British Telecom, but before that it was called the GPO, which is the General Post Office. But it ran the telephone. It ran the Twisted Pair telephone network. And my father used to, it's difficult to know, isn't it, where these things sort of start. They've been with you so long in your whole life that you think, where did it all begin? But my father used to bring home radios that he bought, for what we call the jumble sales, but where people just get rid of all their household possessions, and he'd buy these old radios and start repairing them. And when you're a kid, 7, 8, 9 years old, you think, wow, what's inside a radio? It's got valves in it and other stuff, and gets hot and makes noises and plays music. I was fascinated. And I was also fascinated that we had a broadcast radio, which back in the early 60s, late 50s, of course, that was the golden age of shortwave broadcasting. So the old radios that had shortwave bands on the domestic valve radios, you could tune round and you could hear just incredible stuff like Voice of America, Russian, and all manner of stations from around the world. And I was just fascinated by this. So from a pretty early age, I was inside a valve radio. Didn't really know what I was doing half the time, but I was in there. That carried on for a bit. The big turning point was at my school. The science lecturer was just about 1965, 64. My science teacher was quite go-ahead, and I think he got a job lot of, I think they were TRF transistor radios from Heathkit, the Heathkit company, still sort of around, but back in the day, it was just an incredible, they made absolutely kits for everything. And it was a boys' school, so it was all boys, and I think he basically got hold of or went to Heathkit and bought 20, 30, 40 of these little radios and said, well, boys, go, who wants one? You can make one of these, get your parents to pay. I don't know how much, but my parents paid. And I built one of these little TRF medium wave radios. And the big turning point one evening was that I slid the ferrite coil down the ferrite rod a bit, or moved it, and it went off the bottom of medium wave, of course, and it went into 160 meters, which is just off the bottom of medium wave, so a couple hundred kilohertz off, and it went off the bottom. And of course, it was not very sensitive, but there was a chap talking, and I said to my father, what is this bloke talking about? Because it clearly wasn't a broadcast station. And he said, I think it's a radio ham. And it was a radio ham called G3ZPS, Brian Herbert, who's long silent key now. And he was talking about stuff. And he was probably younger than I am now, wartime RAF pilot, as I found out when I met him. But I phoned my friend, who was sort of like-minded, and I said, have you got that little radio we made at school? And he said, yeah. I said, well, move the aerial down and see if you can hear this guy talking. And he called me back on the telephone and said, I can hear this chap. And it turned out he was closer to him than it was to me. But we could both hear. So we were both fascinated by this chap talking. And that was the beginning of discovering, you could talk on the radio and it wasn't broadcast. It was radio outages. And that was the very beginning for me. And that set the tone of my whole life to the present day, that, just that few minutes.
How did you make that next step? It sounds to me like your father was kind of plugged in.
Yeah, 60 years ago. I can't quite remember how it happened. I started to get hold of magazines in the UK. I think some people must have given me some radio ham magazines, like Shortwave magazine here in the UK, and the RSGB magazine. They must have given me some. My parents started buying me a magazine called Radio Constructor, which was mainly broadcast, but it had ham radio stuff in it. My friend, he had access to some magazines as well, and his parents, I think, were also, had some understanding. And we quickly built this friendship and started to unravel this strange hobby. And very near where I lived at the time, there was a 2-meter beam on a house in the garden, 2-meter beam at the bottom of the garden. So when you're like 13 or 14, you just go and bang on somebody's door, don't you? I just walked down the road from where I lived as a kid and crossed over the road.
Oh, we still do it when we're over 60, don't you?
Yes. And a woman came to the door and I said, "There's a radio ham here." And she said, "Oh, you want to meet William, Bill? I'll go and get it." And I went into this guy's shed at the bottom of his garden, and he was all on VHF. Wow, VHF, what's that? It's completely, here I am listening to, 1.8 megs off the transistor radio, and suddenly here's this guy somewhere up near visible light or something in the spectrum. And so that was another, and he sort of told me, well, you have to get a license and you can talk to people and you'll need to do an exam. Oh, God, that's going to be, back in the day with no internet, no nothing, it's all a voyage of discovery, isn't it? You're a similar age, but everything, you're scrambling, aren't you, for tidbits, somebody can give you some information or a magazine, and you gradually build up this sort of knowledge. But somewhere or another, we started to pick up loads of junk radios with bits, and I can't remember when I couldn't solder anything together. Some of these magazines, they showed how to make a transmitter with 3 valves, a VFO, a buffer, and then an output valve, the early top band type of transmitters. And I don't know how I didn't die. I really don't know how I didn't get electrocuted. I don't remember my parents ever complaining or ever saying, "Don't touch that," or "Don't do that." Soldering iron, mains, voltage, transformers. It just seems like another world. My friend Chris, we now lives in Canada. We started to, I could knock up a few valves in an afternoon after school. Seemed so easy. Resistors, capacitors. You didn't even need the right value.
Close enough for government work, yeah.
Well, it didn't matter. No, I mean, a valve, 100K resistor, I haven't got one, used 200. So I quickly learned the color code, and we started trying to make a transmitter unsuccessfully because we were like 4 miles apart. But we had an epiphany where we built a 3-valve transmitter, all just, junk bits, and in his bedroom, and he just wound the coil. I mean, no test kit, no nothing. And we went into his toilet in his house and took the light bulb out because I think it's lower power back in those days, like 20-watt light bulb. And we wired this light bulb to the output of the transmitter, and it lit up. So we thought, wow, there must be something coming out here. And I had no idea what frequency. We were on somewhere in medium wave. And we connected it up to a wire down his garden, just a bit of wire. And I cycled back home, and I could hear it. I could hear it on the radio. Whatever radio it was, I could hear it. I could hear the carrier. And, it's difficult to get over the sense of excitement that you have made something. And it's making a noise over 4 miles away. And that was really once we worked out that you could make a transmitter as simple as that, it was but a short step then to, trying to get audio onto it and cobbling together circuits and getting bits of surplus gear. We found a shop near where we lived that sold surplus electronic gear. And London was a magnet for it. It just had so many shops selling, surplus electronics and telephones that you could just get stuff really, really cheaply, pocket money. And we were away. That was the beginning of it for me. There was no stopping after that. I wanted a better receiver. Working for my father, like you, with your paper round or whatever you did, or your babysitting. I helped my dad doing work in people's houses, and he gave me money. And with that money, I bought a better receiver, and that just opened the door a bit more. And then we had to come to this, how are you going to get a ham radio license? When I was like 14, 15, and that was the next big step. I could make stuff, I could talk to my friend, albeit basically, but now, how do you actually become one of these?
There was an age requirement also then, right, in England?
Yeah, 14 was the age requirement then. I was 14, 15, so I knew I was over that. And you had to take an exam. There was only one exam then. It was called the Radio Amateurs Exam, the RAE. It was a written exam. All of us, and it was mainly young lads, how do you do? You have to take this exam. So you have to buy a book somehow to read up. And, of course, it's like the other exams we took at school. You have to write. And there were 2 sections to the exam. One was technical and one was license condition. And you just had to go away and read whatever you could and try and get hold of somebody who got the papers or an old paper. There was another key element to it back in those days. already early in the 60s, the post office had started issuing VHF only ham radio licenses with a G8 prefix, because forward thinking, they could see that VHF and UHF was going to be really important. And my friend down the road from me with the VHF aerial, he was a G8 call sign, but that precluded any operation on HF. That was not in the license condition. So if you wanted to get on HF, you had to take a Morse test, 12 words a minute, an accredited location like shipping, ship to shore station, or a post office that offered the test, and you had to pass plain language, reading, transmitting, and letters. And without that, it didn't matter. If I passed the exam, I'd be stuck on VHF, and that was really difficult. Without any test gear, getting on VHF for a school kid, that was a little bit more difficult. You could do it because there was surplus PMR, private mobile radio, valve gear that went in cars, taxis, police, that sort of thing. But it was harder. So I had to do the Morse. There was no tutoring for Morse much in those days. I didn't really know anybody. So you just had to get on with it, really, learn all the letters. My parents would drive around and I'd read all the signs on the cars and, try and do it in my head. And I was getting pretty good at it. And I did pirate. So I bought a Morse key because you didn't need a modulator or anything. And you could pirate on the radio and pretend to be somebody who wasn't in a call book, which is all a bit naughty, very naughty.
But we won't tell anybody here. It's just between us.
It was a long time ago. And I got pretty good on the key, and you had to, because I was never going to get the call, get the HF license. So I took the exam in a college in southeast London with a lot of other young lads. There weren't so many older people joining it as there are now. It was mainly young lads with a technical sort of background, and so I took the exam, and I can vaguely remember sitting and writing, longhand about F layer propagation and the signals, what they do. I don't know how I did it. It was pretty basic, I think, the block diagram of superhet radio or something like that. And I don't know, then you wait for the postman. And the postman came through and I'd passed. And I'd just also got a job as an electronics engineering apprentice, partly by claiming at the interview that I was going to be a radio ham. And one of the three people who interviewed me for this government apprenticeship was, I think it was G3HRO, which is a call sign of a classic receiver, which I knew about. And he was very impressed that I knew this and knew, a bit about electronics. So I got the job, and then I'm waiting for the license. I'm waiting for the exam. That comes through, passed, fantastic. Got to get a Morse test. So immediately managed to get a Morse test in London and went up to London. And as I was already musically inclined, I'm pretty good on the key. It's quite a musical thing, Morse code. And I mean, they were very good for youngsters. Some of these examiners, they weren't going to fail you unless you were really bad. So give us a few. They give you a book and got the Morse key there. I went through. I got it, and then I can remember phoning up the licensing authorities here in London. Waterloo Bridge House in London. I can remember phoning it up, in a squeaky voice. Well, have I got my call sign yet? He said, yes, you have. And it's G3ZPS. I thought, wow. Now the attraction for me of getting this call sign, the G3 call sign, is significant for me, because when I started shortwave listening, a lot of the people I heard had a G3 call sign. And the reason they had that is that after the Second World War, the licensing authorities had up to that point been issuing 2-letter calls like G2WI and G5UM, all those old calls. And those guys are still about. They're probably younger than me now. But the G3 calls started just after the war with G3A in 1946 or 47. And then the rate of license passes of people, taking and getting a call sign was about 1 letter a year. Bit quicker, a bit slower some years, depending. So by 1970, they were at the end. They were at the end of the G3 calls. It started 1947. 23 years later, they're at the end. G3Z, because Q was never issued for obvious reasons. So they're at the end. So if I didn't get in before the end of 1970, the G3s would be gone. G3ZPS would be issued, finished. Next call sign, G4AAA. And as I've been listening to all these people, in my, in my childhood memory burnt into it, I wanted a G3 call. So if I'd have waited and taken the Morse test a few months later, I wouldn't have got a G3 call. So I did get a G3 call, and it's near the end. And the upshot of that is that most of the G3 call holders who haven't been reissued will actually be older than me. I'm one of the youngest. There are a few G3 call holders from the original, period, late 1960s, who are maybe a year younger than me, but there's not many of them and not many on the air. So whenever I talk about the age of my call sign, because some British, the younger hands, would think that I'm, 100 years old and, some very, very elderly man, but I'm not. And that's a bit of a surprise because the G3 calls is...
It's kind of a badge of honor. I have a WA6 call.
I know you did.
WA and WB6 calls are from the 70s, but for some reason, new hams don't take those calls. So in a way, it's kind of like your G3 call in that it's kind of like this badge of being in for 50 years, right?
Yeah.
Let me ask, you got this opportunity to take this apprenticeship while you were in, I guess in America we'd call it in high school.
Yeah, secondary school, they call it, yeah.
Secondary school. Can you tell us, how did being a radio amateur then as a high school student, as a student in secondary school, how did it influence your personal and professional life? I mean, are there specific skills that you gained through amateur radio that you have found are mostly and particularly beneficial?
That's a very good question, and one that I've wrestled with a lot with the way the hobby has moved now, well into the 21st century. Taking it one step at a time, the skills that I learned pretty much by myself and with a few elmers or mentors, whatever you want to call them, people that I'd met before 1970, had built up an understanding of the communication technology as it was at the time. And I had a bit of an exposure to VHF as well. So immediately that got me into my apprenticeship. So that was a step that perhaps without the hobby, almost certainly I would think, who would know the past, that got me into that first step. So the other thing to say is, when you're really into a hobby, when you're a lad, a boy of 14, 15, 16, especially electronics, you are deemed to be by the other kids in the school a nerd. There's no way around it. You are a nerd, and maybe not in a good way for them. And that certainly seemed, that certainly reflected back on me. That they really thought we were nerds, my friend and Chris and myself, because they weren't doing that. They were, dreaming of other things, not, becoming a radio ham. So the first thing was, the negative effect on me is that, you're a nerd. And I can remember being early on at college, just after I started my apprenticeship, that I didn't know a lot of what other people were on about, really. Other, young lad things. I just didn't, I was so immersed in it. So I think the first thing about it is that it got me into this next step. And then when I started the apprenticeship, of course, there's a government apprenticeship, only 50, 60, mainly boys, a few young women. But the selection criteria of the sort of people that would become inventive engineers, people who could think, really widely. The selection criteria, I didn't really know it at the time, but it brought together people with a sort of similar mindset. So there were other people in that group of 50, and of course the years above me who were older, who understood the hobby and knew a bit about it. So immediately that gives you a sort of a step up a little bit. And of course I could solder and I could read resistor color codes. So any of the projects that we were given, to do, and it was a structured apprenticeship where you built stuff. I could do it. I could wire up. I could build things. But as things progressed, when I got a little bit older, 18, 19, the government apprenticeship basically offered you the ability, along with your qualifications, to pick something that you wanted to do that would advance your understanding. Very forward thinking. So is there anything in electronics or I'm working for, it was the government, it was defence, MOD. So, ground radio and VHF radio. And I, they knew, all the people around me knew that, this was something I really was going to be in my blood. I was interested in weather satellites and stuff. And I had the ability then to start learning about VHF and UHF. And I had people around me who could teach me stuff, and I was still an apprentice. And they just, I don't remember much about it. They just recognise that you can think, you're going to be widely thinking about communication. That had a direct impact on where I was going to go with the job. Immediately after the apprenticeship, I went into a lab which was designing RF test equipment. And what was in there, of course, another radio ham. He was the head of the lab. I'm still in contact with him. He lives in America on the Canadian border, Paul, and I've forgotten his call sign for the moment, but we've kept in contact for the whole 50 plus years. And he, you meet people and that moves you forward a bit. And I became interested in VHF and UHF. VHF 2 meters here in the early 70s was just taking off with FM and SSB. The technology had just got to the point where it was doable. There was commercial gear becoming available, and I got very interested in it. And then I started to build up a standing of propagation and tropo, and my parents let me put beams on the roof of the house and God knows what. And I was off and running really at a next level, plus my qualifications and the job. Without that would have not have moved me to the next step, which is, you've read on my website, which is working for the Met Police, which I started in the early 80s. And there I started all that radio ham training, all that understanding about propagation and antennas and VHF and UHF. All of that fed into a job which needed a lot of thinking about VHF communications in London for the emergency services. And so I think it's a long answer to a simple question, but all of it influenced everything I've ever done professionally. And without the hobby, starting it, who knows what I might have been. I might have ended up as a guitar player, I don't know. So that all, and then I became interested in systems and system engineering and the way that things, go together. And also everywhere I went, every technical comms, whatever company I went to, there were radio hams there. They were there, and you had a common understanding and common conversation, and it broke the ice, and it meant you had a level of understanding. You didn't need to go from the bottom up. You could start somewhere and talk and move up from there. And without that hobby, of course, I wouldn't have had that. Things are different now.
Well, nerds are still nerds, I guess.
Yeah.
There was something, Steve, as I recall, about being a nerd and being identified as one, is that when I graduated from high school, I was able to get a job as an electronics technician making 3-4 times the minimum wage out of high school. And all of the people that recognized me as a nerd were working at Taco Bell for minimum wage. So there was some justice at the end of it.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. That's right. It pays off in the end, but it's still rather uncomfortable.
Yeah, it was uncomfortable, but what can you do? And now this break. The QSO Today project that includes this podcast and the QSO Today Academy is now listener-sponsored. There are no commercial sponsors who influence the content and opinions expressed on QSO Today, including my blog posts. Disclaimer, we did not have a problem with sponsor influence when we did have commercial sponsors. The world is different now. I believe that commercial sponsorship, where you watch and listen to TV, radio, YouTube, Facebook, and X for free, does give sponsors complete control over all that you see and hear. The largest networks are now dominated by international corporations who decide in their boardrooms what we hear, know about, how we vote, and what we buy. Commercial sponsorship models for podcasts don't work, maybe for good reasons. At QSO Today, we are back to blogging and podcasting for the free expression of ideas, discussion, and the dissemination of content without commercial sponsorship. It takes everyone's ideas and approaches in our discussions to formulate our own way, with the best information available. This has always been the best formula for success, even in ham radio. So QSO Today is now value for value, following the model created by another ham, Adam Curry, K5AAC, inventor of podcasting and the value for value business model. I create valuable amateur radio content that you consume. In return, you find it valuable, then you reward the podcast with your sponsorships, donations, transcription sponsorships, and using the QSO Today Amazon link. Your supporting the podcast in this way keeps QSO Today podcast coming to you every week since July of 2014, now approaching 500 episodes. In addition, we have over 500 educational ham radio videos from previous QSO Today Virtual Ham Expos that we also publish to allow every ham to benefit from these excellent presentations. However, all of this content has to be produced, edited, curated, and hosted on commercial platforms by me and my team to keep it easily accessible and available to you. Links and banners on the show notes pages allow you to show your support of the QSO Today project. Please support QSO Today with your sponsorships, donations, and using our Amazon links. And now back to our QSO Today. I had a chance to look at your website, and I'm going to put links into Steve's website on the show notes page, and I encourage all of the listeners to go there and look. But you have a notable interest in refurbishing old amateur radio gear. Most notably, I saw Yaesu and Drake equipment, but then, if you look at all the tabs, there's other equipment that you also talk about. What drew you to this aspect of the hobby, and what has been the most rewarding project that you've done to date?
Wow, another good question. I took a big break from the hobby is the first thing. When I became really professionally involved at a higher level in the communications business, got married and had young children, I took a complete break from the hobby. So there was a period there where I, 20 years from about 1982 through to early 2000s, where I didn't go anywhere near it. I didn't read anything. I didn't know anything about the hobby. I'd left it. So my memory of when I came back to it was really of the hobby as it was when I left it. And there is no doubt that when you're 15 and 16, and I've mentioned this in one of my talks, that you're in that point where you become obsessed with one or two things. And it's why I think we remember the music from that period, and we remember some of the key people we met. It's probably why you remember your school friends, and you remember the teachers, the lecturers, in a way that you don't many years later. At that age, things burn into your mind in a way. I can remember the lyrics from songs from that period in a way that I can't now. So there's something about that. And so all that old kits, the old ham radio gear that I could never afford, even when I first started my apprenticeship, Drake was very expensive here, and I used to go to rallies and swap meets, as sometimes they're called, not in the UK, and I'd see this gear. I've got some here right now, and it was just out of reach, and it looked fantastic, and I heard it on people using it on the radio. And the KW gear, which is a British manufacturer, which we'll talk about in a minute, was a little bit more within reach. And then Yaesu came along with their FT101, which I speak about on my website, which effectively started to kill off the American and the Brits and probably others as well, their business, because they didn't have the global production capability, production line and marketing, and the price and the quality level as Yaesu were going transistorized to compete. So that gear was disappearing, and I knew that. But it was also appealing because it was in that period of my life where I was reading a magazine, and that's all you had. You read every word. When I came back to the hobby 20 years ago, the gear I had to dig out was old Yaesu gear. One or two, it was in the loft. It had moved with me, and it was here. I got it out, and I realised that the whole hobby had moved on in a way that I just hadn't known. I'd just not been involved, not been anywhere near it. But this gear seemed to work all right. And because my history of being able to be inside a valve radio since probably the late 50s, early 60s, meant that when it played up a little bit, I had the service manual, I could repair it. And I didn't know if I was going to be bothered with the hobby. I didn't want to spend thousands of pounds on a new transistorized radio. So I just... People had other stuff in the loft that they gave to me. And I thought, well, this is just like the old days, really. I can just open it up and there's all those familiar components from the 60s. Each part of the radio does something by itself, and then you move on, preamp, IF, power output. And I wasn't frightened of 800 volts or 1,000 or 2,000. It didn't frighten me, and I wasn't frightened of any of that. Whereas other people I discovered, now into the 2000s were like, they get hot and there's high voltage. But that my background didn't worry me. So and then a friend of mine said, I've got a Drake R4B you might be interested in. So I bought that. And then it just snowballed, really, and I couldn't stop. And I found that other people said, oh, you're interested in this old gear. And before long, just like probably in the 60s and when I was a kid, things started to snowball again, and I couldn't stop it. And I had the money, and so I was nearing sort of retirement. I started to have a little bit more time. And it just became, along with collecting guitars and playing and everything, they just started appearing because people would find them and they'd phone me up, or I started the website up and they'd call me and say, I've got an old bit of gear here. Are you interested in it? And it just started to snowball. It was really only that, Eric. It started to snowball off, and I started buying spare parts, and I rejoined the Cray Valley Radio Club. So I shout out to Cray Valley Radio Club, one of the biggest in the UK for one club, nearly 150 members. And I discovered some like-minded people there. But it really all goes back to that background of being inside valve gear right from the early stage, a minute to build everything, that it doesn't frighten you in any way, and B, there's an intuitive understanding. There's that part of it. And the other part of it is wanting to, I can't explain it really, but it's wanting to get something back to how it was when it was made. If it's really beaten up, can you bring it back? I don't know. It's just something in me about, if you get given something, it's like restoring an old car, maybe, or it's like restoring a house. I mean, I equate it to cars and houses because you've got to have the commitment, the time, the energy, and some of the knowledge. You don't need it all at the beginning. I got things wrong.
It's part of the hobby, though, is to get things wrong. If you don't get things wrong, you don't get things right later. Yeah.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Oh yeah, I've had the magic smoke out on more than one occasion.
I was looking at your website, and you have a whole page on KW Electronics, and I don't think most American hams have ever heard of KW Electronics, but the gear looks kind of familiar, or maybe it was kind of modeled after something else. Who was KW Electronics, and what did they manufacture?
Immediately after the war, and actually before the war, after the war, and I said this in my presentation, there wasn't a great deal of off-the-shelf ham radio kit in the UK to buy. Of course, you could buy and build stuff in the surplus, and the changing demographic and changing post-war society meant, I think, that some people in houses didn't want just wires and bits of ex-army surplus everywhere. There was a beginning market to have something you could buy off the shelf and put on your desk in your shack, and it would look, more professional. It wouldn't have, ex-army bits and bobs and homemade things hanging out of it, which would be very dangerous as well. But there was and post-war in this country, people started to have a bit more money. The idea of having something off the shelf was starting to get appealing. Of course, in America, you had Collins, the biggest, but there were other manufacturers, Hammerland and Hallicrafters, but there wasn't a great deal of stuff here. And as times move, a couple of enterprising individuals, Rowley Shears, G8 KW, and Ken Ellis, G5 KW, both had incredibly interesting wartime experiences. They were both pre-war call signs, and they came out of the war on the other side and met up and thought about starting a company which would start selling into this emerging market of ham radio gear rather than just surplus. And in the 50s, not far from here, they started a company called KW Electronics. I don't know that either of them got the call sign. KW doesn't mean kilowatt. At the time, we don't know if they requested, and they worked in different parts of communications. Some's quite secretive, which I talk about, only as in the last few years become well known. But they got together and started this company in the early 50s. The first company they built a relationship outside of was the Italian company Geloso. who'd started also making domestic ham radio things, some of it, looking nice. You could have a transmitter and a receiver and it would be off the shelf. It would work straight away. And started to import that into the UK, and then decided that maybe they could start building stuff, kits, marketing it as an off-the-shelf transmitter. Now they'd copied the design, they'd borrowed the designs from elsewhere, and they started building AM gear just down the road from here and selling AM transmitters, as well as being an agent for some of the other I think, American companies. But the American stuff was expensive over here. They were quite forward-thinking because in the late 50s, AM was still certainly in Europe and in the UK, AM was still very, very popular. But SSB was appearing, and Drake in the US started to see that SSB was going to be the future of tabletop ham radio, something you could have off the shelf. And KW saw that here as well, quite forward-thinking. But they didn't have any designs. They built some separate transmitters and receivers. But basically, they borrowed the circuit topology of the Collins KWM2. I don't know how they did it. There was no copyright on, the frequencies that go into a radio, but they copied the topology, so the frequency block and the filtering, they copied that. Not the same components, everything cut down, because that gear, the American gear, was expensive here in the 60s. Drake gear was very expensive. Just the receiver cost you £300-400, which was a lot of money back then.
In those days, yeah.
And the Collins equipment was very expensive, but it was used by the military, wasn't it, in America, and even into the 21st century, I think, certainly in the 90s, but the valve gear, and it was all professionally made with fantastic manuals. But if you cut all that out, if you cut out all of the, if you literally pare everything back and make it, from as low a cost as you can, which is what KW did, and they were just down the road from a friend of mine here in Dartford, which is where they were based. Interestingly, just up the road from me here is where Vox made all the amplifiers that the Beatles used. So we had the music technology, the valve amplifiers for the rock groups in the early 60s, and we had KW Electronics making ham radio gear. And they hit a sweet spot of gear, because they hit a price point that was well below the imported American gear at the time. And they had some extra features on their radios, which a lot of others didn't. The American gear, a lot of it didn't have top band. The Drake transceivers didn't have top band.
Which is the 160 meter band, yeah.
160 meter band, and that was very popular here on AM and on SSB. So the KW guys put top band. They also put an RIT in clarifier, which was not on the Drake transceivers until very late on, because those radios all drifted. Of course they drifted. They had valve VFOs in them. So they put that in, and they came out with a package that was, for a period, appealing. And the thing for me is, in the early 70s, my friend lived very near the factory here, and I could come over and see him. He's Silent Key now, Paul G4 Bravo X-Ray Tango. And I met him on the radio, and I came over to see him, and he said, we can go to KW's, we can go. And I went with him to their factory and showroom on a Saturday morning, and they knew that we were 19, that we didn't have any money. We weren't going to buy a shiny new KW transceiver. And they had a showroom with a tri-band beam, there's a picture of it on the website, and they had all the gear laid out. And they were good to us. They were very good to us. They knew we were lads. They knew we had no money. It was like, you can have a tune around, you can have a play, but don't transmit. And if anybody comes in with cash to pick up their gear, we might ask you to go. And they gave us cups of tea. And I really thought, what a great little company. And I discovered the apprentices in the company were about the same age as me as well. And they were doing pretty much what I was doing. I had a government apprenticeship, because there were initiatives in those days for companies to hire apprentices. So they hired young lads to wire up these radios. And there they were being made right there, just up the road from me. And I did manage to get hold of some of their gear. It was made down to a price point, but it's got, the attraction was it was made just down the road, and not many, people can say that.
And now this mid-show break. Every 2 weeks, I listen to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast with George, KJ6VU, Vince, VE6LK, Mark, N6MTS, Thomas, K4SWL, Michael, VA3MW, and Rod, VA3ON, and their guest on often topical and important projects in amateur radio. This discussion amongst the regulars and their guests remind me of the conversations that I used to listen to on 146.94 and 146.46 megahertz in Orange County, California, while working on my own workbench almost 50 years ago. It is amazing how much practical ham radio knowledge that we can absorb by listening to the Workbench podcast that starts to make sense when we start our own deep dive into our own projects. So join me by listening to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast now and as George and crew push beyond 200 episodes. You can get to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast by clicking on the banner in this week's show notes page. And now, back to our QSO. How many transceivers did they make, or how many models? I mean, were they long-lasting? Did they last in through the 70s?
The Japanese invasion of Yaesu, Icon, or Inui as it was at the time, and Kenwood was Trio at the time here in the UK, started to appear in 1970. But before that, but up until that point, I think there was probably a concern that something that was imported from the Far East, if it couldn't be repaired. The thing about KW Electronics is you could drive there just down the road from where I'm sitting now on a Saturday morning. You could drop your faulty radio off, and you could pick it up in the afternoon because they had quite a good customer service ethic. And there was probably a general slight amongst the ham radio buying public in the UK that Japanese gear, it can't be that good. And here I am, I can buy something locally and go and get it repaired. But of course, things move very, very quickly. And I think that when those guys saw an FT101, the run that started in 1970, when they realised that when you turned it on, it came up straight away because it had transistors in the receiver, and that the power supply was built in the box, and it had an AC and DC power supply built in, so you could use it mobile straight off. All you needed was a microphone, a lead, DC or AC, and an antenna, because match into anything. And Drake as well, it was the death knell, and KW just couldn't. They didn't have the resources, the expertise and resources to develop ham radio gear which would anyway compete with this tide that was coming in. And of course the Yaesu gear was fantastic. The production line pictures look incredible. The wiring is superb. The components they used were quite high quality. Number of FT101s sold is just astronomical.
I remember the period because in America you had Swan, if you remember Swan.
I've got Swan, yeah.
Atlas. You had a whole bunch of American companies that were trying their hand in ham radio. And then like the mid-70s, all of a sudden, they kind of faded away, and you had the Japanese. You had ICOM and Yaesu and Kenwood.
Yeah, Tentec. And some of them made the leap into Tentec carried on for quite a long time. And Swan made some nice little transistorized radios, but the production level quantity coming out of Japan at the time, it just the tide just it just tsunami, wasn't it? It rolled over. Drake was still making. I've got a TR4 here, Drake TR4, a late one. That's 1977. And there's a magazine that it's in 1977, a last production run before they went to the TR7, which in itself was a good transistorized radio. And in that magazine, there's the Yaesu FT901 being offered, which had everything built in. It had a keyer built in. It had a tune-up timer built in. It had an proper FM board, not proper AM board, not going through the sideband filter. Had all those modes. It had a CW filter. It had a CW audio filter. It had all of that and a power supply and everything built in. And Drake was still advertising their TR4, which is almost all valve except for the VFO. You've got to wait for it to warm up. They'd managed to get RIT into it by then, very late on. But it just looked like it was 2 generations behind. So Drake clung on. KW saw the writing on the wall, and they had been doing a lot of commercial work. for others and for themselves. KW just couldn't compete. They brought out one or two models. They brought out an interesting one is the KW Atlanta, which I've got, which is almost a direct circuit copy of a Swan 500. How they managed to get away with it, they did sell a few in America. KW didn't sell a lot in America because this British company had markets in Canada, New Zealand, Australia, where the import arrangements are probably different than into the US. But they copied this radio with the sweep tubes in it and its claimed 500 watts. Again, they took a design from somewhere else, but this time they copied almost every component. But again, it was cut down in quality. Everything was cut back. But I used the Swan manual to repair the KW kit. The reality was by 1971, 72, the writing was on the wall. Unless you could compete in this market, you were going to die. And KW sold up to Decca in the early year. They sold to Decca.
That was the end of Heathkit. That was the end of all of those guys, I think, by the mid-'70s. They just couldn't do it.
No, the Heathkit, and I've restored some of their kit as well, because that's, it's the hot water and sugar baker series of Heathkit. That's on my website as well, and that's great fun to restore. But again, your Tempo 1, your FT200 was only a little bit more than the kit, and yet it was off the shelf.
Shiny and working. Steve, considering the rapid technological changes in the world, how do you see the role and techniques of amateur radio evolving? As it appears to me, you also have QRP Labs and BitX gear in your collection.
I do.
What keeps the hobby relevant and exciting for you amidst these changes?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't operate quite as much, and I haven't restored quite as much since I did quite a lot in COVID, since post-COVID. So I've sort of dropped back a little bit because my music has taken off more, so I've had less time for it. But it's an interesting. I like the QRP gear, and I still like building stuff, and I've met Hans Summers, and been to Friedrichshafen quite a few times, and I still enjoy the vintage gear. I turned on my Drake TR4 yesterday, so for me, I've probably reached a point where what I've got at my age is probably all I'm going to do. I've run out of room. If I never sell anything, that's the other problem with nerds, isn't it? When they collect stuff, I never sell it. So for me, the relevance is probably about the same now. I like the QRP. My wider interest is how it's relevant to other people, and that's a more difficult question, because for me, the hobby was always about the technology, about either old or new technology. It was about what's inside the box, how does it work, what's it like to communicate, it's still magic to me when I listen to, a guy in New Zealand talking on 15 or 10 meters. But it's different now. And I say to people I meet, because I do a lot of special events, some big special events, and I say to people, have you got a digital radio on you? And they go, no, I haven't got one of them. No, I don't know what you're talking about, mate. And I go, well, I've got one. Here it is. It's a radio and a computer, and it's all in a box. And who do you think designed it? And who did the software, and who made the radio part work? And don't we need people to be able to do that? Because it used to be, like it was for me, it was a window into the technology of communications technology. But it's difficult to see that now, because the reality is, most of this stuff is designed either in the US or in the Far East. So as far as being a window into it, I think it's difficult. But I think, wouldn't the universities who are teaching about comms and technology, you've got free, if you but take a simple exam to get a foundation license, and you can learn about digital communications at FTA, FT4, and all the others. Wouldn't that be a step into coding and understanding, more about how this thing works, or through 5G and 6G in the future? But that might be a naive view, but, I would think, wow, if I was interested in that, and I could bounce stuff off the moon, or I could, the satellite, there's a geostationary satellite, Oscar 100. These are all almost free resources for young engineers interested in digital technology to be able to use with take an exam, maybe the university. But I don't see that as much anymore. When I was young, every university had a ham radio station in it because it taught electronics, and you'd have ham radio alongside it. like for me, it would be a window into that sort of employment, and as it was for me. But I don't see that now, and that's a bit disappointing for me. I've just done a foundation course training and mentored the tap, and it is more older people now, and maybe they're getting into it for social aspects, not so much for the learning. The relevance for me probably hasn't changed very much, but I'm very interested to find out how it's relevant to other people coming into it.
What I see, Steve, is that, and I'm guilty, all of the organizations, the large national organizations, amateur radio clubs, including QSO Today, we tend to speak in our own silo. If we know our neighbors' names, they don't know anything about amateur radio. We don't tend to talk to the general public anymore, except maybe on field day, about amateur radio and what amazing history it has over the last 100 years and what contributions amateur radio has made to the well-being of mankind, perhaps. Even the technology that everyone's carrying around. The cell phone camera in everyone's cell phone was made by an amateur radio operator at Apple who I interviewed. So I'm just saying that I think we don't do a very good job of letting the general public know that we still even exist.
No.
And perhaps there's something we can do about that. It seems to me that should be with the deep pockets of the national organizations, that they should be able to hire a marketing specialist that knows something about talking to people who are not technically savvy about what this hobby could be as a launching board to a lifetime of interest and curiosity.
Yes, I think, well, you've said it, Eric, really. That's we don't do a very good job. I've done some big special events. Last year I did the King's Coronation special event in London with my club, Cray Valley. We operated in Greenwich Park, Southeast London, for 5 days and nights, right by the Cutty Sark ship, which is here in Greenwich in London, near the Greenwich Meridian. And we had visitors from around the world passing by. We've got a couple of new members out of it. But you're right, people come in and go, is it CB? Citizens Band. But no, you're right. We don't do a very good job at all. But that's probably for another time. Maybe we won't ever do a very good job with it. I don't know. It's very difficult to. It's moved so far out of public consciousness now because this is so ubiquitous. So it's very difficult to get through to somebody. Why would you want to do that hobby when I could talk to somebody in New Zealand in 1 minute and just have a chat with them? Or it's very difficult to get that over, that there is actually more to it. It's very hard.
I can tell you, Steve, if you live in a war zone, which I am right now.
I know you are.
This idea that your $1 trillion worth of infrastructure that you'd use to talk with your smartphone, I think most people don't realize how much infrastructure is involved in making a smartphone work.
No, that's a very good point.
And it's so fragile. The disagreement I'm having with my wife right now is she insisted I buy a generator just in case we lose power here. So I bought a generator, but, I'm a ham, and so I bought a 7,000-watt generator, and I'm converting it to natural gas, which means that this generator's been sitting in the living room now for 2 weeks, and it's still not running. I finally got the last pieces today I needed to finish the conversion, but she's expecting that before I get my dinner tonight that thing is going to be running out in front of the house, or I get no dinner tonight. So I'm just saying that one thing leads to another, and I know that if that smartphone goes away, I have the ability with all the stuff I have here to continue to communicate not only in the country but outside of the country.
Absolutely.
And that makes a big deal. And I think that most people don't understand that that's maybe what's needed.
No, absolutely. Why would they understand that when you're sitting in a comfortable, suburb of southeast London where everything in the world, your local little world is right? It doesn't seem possible, does it, to most people that it could ever not be like that. It could ever go away. The relevance of the hobby is it's so far down.
It may ebb and flow. We could end up having a resurgence, a renaissance of amateur radio as a result of what's going on. Let me ask you, and I encourage the listeners to go to YouTube and look up your name, and I'll put some relevant links, YouTube links, but you're an amazing guitar player, obviously from an era when guitar playing was over the top, and you're an over-the-top guitar player and performer. Does the musical side of your life impact your community and even your amateur radio community? Do they cross over?
Yeah, they do, yeah. Interesting, that, isn't it? Yeah, people at my club come to see me playing. Yeah, and there is a left, now I'm making this up as I go along, is there a left brain, right brain thing about the logic part of your brain and the creative part of your brain? Because I bump into quite a lot of other radio hands who do play, you as well, play musical instruments. I don't know if there's a left, right brain thing, but of course when you play the guitar and you're playing in pubs and clubs and folk clubs, again, people come out of the woodwork, don't they? They come out and, it does cross over. It crosses over more in a social way. That's the way it crosses over for me. But of course, I can fix all my valve amplifiers as well. So that's the other part of it, and look after the guitars and everything. That's the engineer part of it. But I don't know if it's a creative logic thing in some people. I have no idea. I'm no good at drawing. I could draw technical, but I couldn't draw an impressionist painting of anything. Just useless. But I'm playing the guitar last night in a rock and roll band in a pub. So I don't know. It does cross over, and I haven't really worked out how or why. But there is something there, and maybe it's a left brain, right brain figure. I don't know.
Steve, with your extensive experience in the hobby, and I also took that break from my mid-20s until probably to my late 40s, early 50s. With your extensive experience in the hobby, what advice would you give to someone just starting out in amateur radio today? Are there particular activities or aspects of the hobby that you'd recommend that they explore first?
That's another difficult question to answer when you're older. The majority of people who come into the hobby at the moment who I meet, because I do with the club, we do a lot of training. One of the few clubs we do in-person training, so we actually have the gear. We actually have antennas, and so we get people to talk on the radio. We demonstrate all of that stuff. But the majority of them will end up with one of these. They will end up with a Bafong, or that will be their introduction.
That's your UV5.
Well, yeah, I've got. I don't know. You get them free with your breakfast cereal now. They're so cheap. I've got another one here.
2 eggs, bacon, and a Baofeng, right? That's what you get for amateur radio breakfast.
We have a competition in my club to see who could get one the cheapest, and I think it's just ridiculous. But I think I paid £10. I don't know what that is.
I have an All-Star repeater in my house. I've carried a $300 ICOM portable and dropped it while walking the dog and shredded the inside. Dropping a $25 Baofeng radio on the ground and then reaching into the drawer and pulling out another one to replace it, it's a lot less painful than dropping that ICOM portable on the ground while you're walking the dog.
Yeah, I've got those here as a nice ICOM. I think the advice would be to join a club and talk to people in person. It's a social interaction of you can do it on the air, fine, that's great, but a lot of people are very frightened now about putting antennas up on their house. The EMF radiation thing does frighten people. Here in the UK, we have to have, I know they've been doing it in Germany for a bit longer, but we have to train people on the exams about the EMF. And I think that worries people in a way it didn't worry people years ago, even though you might, hold your cell phone right to your ear. So, putting up wires in the garden is difficult for some houses now, modern houses. Their gardens aren't big enough. So it's talking to people about, what you might be able to get out of the hobby, because they might not be able to get on the air very easily. I think that's, they could go out in their car, or they could Baofeng, and everybody seems to buy them, even though I'm not sure they're type approved everywhere in the world. But I guess, just using it, a hilltop operation to talk to a few people is fine. But it's not, in the 60s, you can stick a bit of wire down the garden, and I don't know how many, you can run, and we can run a kilowatt now. So the EMF calculations that you have to do and hold that, it might put people off. So I think it'd be interesting to see some of the people that we've got through the exams in the last few years. A lot of them do fall by the wayside, probably because of the difficulties of actually doing anything in the hobby. So I think the advice is to join a club and meet as many people face to face as you can, because maybe you're operating and some of your learning will come out of operating elsewhere, maybe not in your house, maybe from your club, or maybe on field days, another thing. But it's hard for me because I come from such a different era in the hobby to understand, to try and encourage somebody. Because getting on HF, it's quite frightening, isn't it? You know, we teach people about an RF ground, and you can imagine they live in a flat or they live in a shack is on the next floor of the house. They start to really worry. Oh, I've got to do this, and I've got to think about the antenna structure, and I've got to think about that I'm not going to breach an EMF guideline and cause interference to my neighbour, and then Ofcom bang on my door and shut me down. Because we didn't have those worries.
Right, in those days. But we do have digital modes now where you could operate low power and...
That's right. And we, at my club, when we did the foundation call, we talked about propagation and the digital modes. And we had a buddy pole in the room. And right at the end of that section of the presentation, we go through the license manual, the presenter said, oh, maybe you probably didn't realise, but this is running like 2 watts in here, in this buddy pole on 20 meters right now while we've been training you. And let's just bring up the Whisper website. And there it is. There we are. There's my call sign, South America. In the room, 2 watts or whatever to this buddy pole antenna. And you could hear people in the room going, wow, because we're inside a building which has got like insulation in the roof. It's probably got metal foil on it. That's sort of thing that you can try. You've got to try and inspire somebody. The other thing, before we close, a friend of mine who I met when I was doing a special event station in Greenwich, lives locally to me, always was interested in the hobby, moving on from CB, and he's very good at building stuff and soldering his hi-fi and stuff. So I gave him the DL2 MAN, is it True SDX, the kit. I had bought the kit. Here it is. That's the thing. I had bought the kit from the club as a construction project. A little HF radio, runs 2 or 3 watts, sideband, got a microphone built in and a terrible loudspeaker. And I said, look, here you go, Dave. You build it. I'm never going to build it. I've got a lot going on at the moment. I'm not. So you're not a radio ham yet, but you love building stuff. You build this. So we had to learn about the toroids. He built it in a week. Wasn't an RF engineer or anything. He built it in a week. And he sent me a note and said, I think it's working, Steve. Can I bring it round? So he brought it round and I plugged it into a dummy load. And sure enough, you could listen to it on a radio here, 3 or 4 watts coming out of it. So I plugged it into my 40-meter dipole. And it was a contest on the 40 meters. So this little box, just running off a little power supply, I just leant into it and called a contest station in Germany, and it came back. And this guy, my friend Dave, was in awe that this little box that he had made in his house, brought it round to me. Instantly, I'm communicating with it across Europe. And it's that little bit of inspiration, isn't it? The plants the little seeds. And you've got to find that with people, I think. As you say, it might be digital mode, might be building something like this. But I was so happy. You know, I was really, because he was so excited. I just picked it up, DL2, whatever it is, G3ZPS. And he came back. And this guy was like, this is amazing. I just made this little black box and it works. And you can communicate on it. So it's difficult to inspire people. You've got to but go into a club and meeting people, for me, where you're in a room with different people. A big club like ours is very good because you could talk about all the aspects. We've got digital TV aspects, we've got contest aspects, not my thing. We've got kit building, and we'll help you get it going. So yeah, my advice would be join a club and meet people, and talk about it and find out if there's something that will, just light your fire a little bit, get you interested, whatever that might be.
Steve, this has been a lot of fun for me. It brings back memories from the early days of ham radio for me, going down memory lane with you. And I enjoyed really doing the research, too, for this episode, because I really enjoyed what Ted Nugent-style guitar playing that you do, and hearing about your ham radio story and looking at the website where you've actually have hundreds of pictures of the rigs that you've worked on, the befores and after pictures. So all of that I'll share with the listeners. So with that, Steve, thank you so much, and I wish you 73. Thanks for coming on QSO today.
73s, Eric, and now you're 4Z1 UG, 73s from Southeast London. Thanks a lot.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Steve. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in G3ZPS in the search box at the top of the page. You may notice that some episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any of the episodes into written text, push the Sponsor Transcription button in the center of every show notes page. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes pages. Your value for value support is recognized on the QSO Today podcast and in the weekly show notes. If listener sponsorship is not for you, then please use our Amazon link when you shop on Amazon. Clicking on this link before you enter Amazon will allow Amazon to pay us a small commission on everything you purchase. This is a very painless way to support the QSO Today podcast, and it costs you nothing. QSO Today is syndicated on every podcast platform by using Podcast Index. Use the latest Podcast 2.0 player on your smartphone to automatically get to your podcast updates as soon as we publish. I'm now using Podverse to track, manage, and listen to my podcasts. Positive comments about QSO Today on social media is appreciated as it helps to grow our listener base. My thanks to Ben Bresky, who makes this podcaster and guests sound brilliant. Thanks, Ben. Until next time, this is Eric, 4Z1UG, 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media, Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.